In a quiet corner of the galaxy, where stars burned dim and planets were harsh and unforgiving, humanity had earned its reputation. They called them Deathworlders, a name given not out of fear, but respect. Humans could survive anywhere, adapt to anything, and fight when all hope seemed lost. It was this stubbornness that made them stand out among the stars. On a small mining colony orbiting a dying red dwarf star, life moved at a slow pace. The air was stale, recycled endlessly through aging machines. Dust coated every surface, carried in by the winds of the barren planet below. Captain Cal Armitage sat alone in the control room, staring at the monitors. His tired eyes scanned rows of data, mineral yields, oxygen levels, security feeds, but nothing unusual caught his attention. Just another day on the edge of nowhere. Cale wasn't much for conversation. At 38, he'd seen enough of the galaxy to know how cruel it could be. He'd lost friends, family, and comrades to its dangers. But here, on this forgotten rock, things were calm. Too calm, some might say. Still, Cale preferred it that way. Peace meant no one died under his watch. Then came the sound. It started as static, a faint crackle over the communication array. Cale frowned and leaned closer to the speaker. Static wasn't uncommon, especially so far from civilized space, but this felt different. There was a rhythm to it, almost like words. "Is anyone there?" He muttered aloud, adjusting the frequency dials. The crackling grew louder, sharper. Then suddenly, a voice broke through. "Help us." The words were distorted, stretched thin by distance and interference, but they were unmistakable. Cale froze, his hand hovering over the controls. Who, or what, was speaking, and why now? He replayed the message, straining to catch more details. After several tries, fragments began to emerge. "They come. They consume. Save us." That was all. No coordinates, no explanation, just those haunting phrases repeated over and over. For a moment, Cale considered ignoring it. Strange signals weren't rare in deep space, and responding often led to trouble. Pirates, scavengers, or worse, they preyed on curiosity. Yet something about this call tugged at him. Maybe it was the desperation in the tone, or maybe it was the fact that the signal had reached them at all. Whoever sent it must have been powerful or desperate enough to try anything. Cale stood up and grabbed his jacket. If he wanted answers, he'd need help. He walked briskly down the narrow corridors of the colony's command center until he reached the lab. Inside, Dr. Lyra Voss was hunched over her desk, surrounded by glowing screens and scattered notes. She looked up as he entered, her sharp green eyes narrowing. "What is it, Cal?" she asked, sensing urgency in his stride. "We got a message," he said simply, tossing her a data chip. "Listen to it." Lyra plugged the chip into her console and played the recording. Her expression shifted from curiosity to concern as the garbled plea echoed through the room. When it ended, she turned to Cale, her voice steady but tinged with excitement. "This isn't human," she said firmly. "And whoever, or whatever, sent it knows we're listening." Cale crossed his arms. "So what do you suggest? We chase ghosts into the void?" "No," Lyra replied, her gaze fixed on the screen. "But if someone out there needs our help, and if they can reach us, we owe it to ourselves to find out why." Cale sighed. He knew she was right. Humanity had survived by taking risks, by stepping into the unknown. Ignoring the call would mean turning their backs on everything that defined them. "All right," he said finally. "Let's see who's calling." As Cale left the lab, he couldn't shake the feeling that this decision would change everything, for better or worse. The next morning, Cale stood in the colony's main hangar, staring at the battered but reliable ship known as the Eclipse Blade. It wasn't much to look at. Its hull was patched with mismatched metal plates, and its engines groaned like an old man climbing stairs, but it had carried them through worse. Today, though, Cale wondered if even the Eclipse Blade could handle what lay ahead. He wasn't alone. Around him, A small group of volunteers gathered, their faces a mix of determination and unease. Among them was Dr. Liravos, clutching a datapad filled with notes about the mysterious signal. Her excitement was palpable, though she tried to hide it behind a professional demeanor. Next to her stood Jack Swark, a grizzled ex-soldier with scars crisscrossing his arms and a perpetual scowl etched onto his face. He leaned against a crate, cleaning his rifle with slow, deliberate movements. "You sure this is a good idea?" Jax asked, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding underfoot. "We don't know who, or what, sent that message. Could be a trap." Cale turned to him, his expression unreadable. "If it is, we'll deal with it. But we can't just ignore it. Not after hearing that." Jax snorted. "Yeah, well, curiosity killed more than cats, Captain." Before Cale could respond, alarms blared throughout the hangar. Red warning lights flashed, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Everyone froze, then sprang into action. Cale sprinted toward the control panel near the entrance, tapping furiously at the screen. "What's going on?" Lyra shouted over the noise. "Power fluctuations," Cale replied, his brow furrowed. "Something's interfering with the grid." As if on cue, the lights flickered and died, plunging the hangar into darkness. For a moment, there was only the sound of panicked breathing and distant machinery sputtering. Then, emergency backups kicked in, bathing the room in dim blue light. That's when they saw it. On one of the security monitors, a drone feed showed movement outside the colony. At first glance, it looked like shifting shadows, nothing more. But as Cal zoomed in, the shapes became clearer, massive insectoid creatures skulking along the rocky terrain. Their bodies gleamed faintly in the low light, segmented limbs clicking against the ground as they moved. "What the hell are those?" Jax growled, gripping his rifle tighter. "No idea," Cale said, his voice tense. "But they're not from around here." Lyra stepped closer, her eyes glued to the screen. "Look at their size. They're bigger than any predator I've ever studied. And those mandibles." She trailed off, shuddering. "They're built for tearing." Cale didn't need her analysis to understand the threat. These weren't random animals. They were scouts. Whatever had sent the distress call, these creatures were connected. The question was, how? "We leave now," Cale announced, turning to the group. "If those things are here, whatever's coming won't be far behind." "But we're not ready," someone protested. "We don't even know where we're going." "We don't have a choice," Cale snapped. "Staying here means waiting for them to find us. Leaving gives us a chance to figure out what's going on, and maybe stop it before it gets worse." No one argued further. There was truth in his words, harsh as they were. Within minutes, the team boarded the Eclipse Blade, strapping themselves in as Cale powered up the engines. As the ship lifted off, Cale glanced out the viewport at the desolate landscape below. The insectoids were still there, watching silently as the colony disappeared into the sky. For the first time in years, Cale felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know what awaited them in the stars. But he was certain of one thing. Humanity's reputation as Deathworlders would soon be tested like never before. The Eclipse Blade cut through the endless void of space, its engines humming steadily as it followed the faint trail left by the mysterious signal. Inside the cramped cockpit, Cale sat with his hands gripping the controls, his eyes fixed on the navigation screen. The coordinates were vague at best, but they were all he had to go on. Behind him, Dr. Lyra Voss pored over her datapad, trying to decipher fragments of the garbled message. Jack's work lounged in a corner, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes, a habit that seemed to calm him more than anything else. "Anything new?" Cale asked without looking back. Lyra shook her head, frustration evident in her voice. "Bits and pieces, but nothing concrete. Whoever sent this knows how to encrypt their transmissions. It's like they're hiding from something. Or someone." Jack snorted, Or maybe they're luring us into a trap. Ever think about that? Kale shot him a glance. We've been over this, Jax. If we don't check it out, we'll never know. And if it is a trap, we'll deal with it. Jax muttered something under his breath, but didn't argue further. He knew better than to push Kale when his mind was made up. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional beep of instruments or the soft hum of the ship's systems. The journey felt endless, the stars outside the viewport stretching into infinity. But then, something changed. A blip appeared on the radar, a large object drifting in the darkness ahead. "What's that?" Lyra asked, leaning forward to get a better look. Kale adjusted the sensors, narrowing the focus. "Looks like a derelict ship. Big one, too." Jax frowned. "You think it's connected to the signal?" "No way to tell unless we take a closer look," Kale replied. He steered the Eclipse blade toward the hulking mass of metal, its surface scarred and battered, as though it had endured centuries of neglect. As they drew nearer, the ship's shape became clearer. It was alien, its design unlike anything human engineers would create. Jagged edges jutted out at odd angles, and strange symbols glowed faintly along its hull. "This doesn't feel right," Jax said, standing up and checking his rifle. "Let's just blow it up and keep moving." "We're not blowing anything until we know what we're dealing with," Kale snapped. "Suit up. We're going in." Reluctantly, the team prepared for boarding. Armed with flashlights, scanners, and weapons, they stepped onto the derelict vessel through an airlock that groaned open with a hiss. The interior was dark and cold, the air thick with the metallic tang of decay. Strange, organic-looking tendrils hung from the ceiling, pulsating faintly as though alive. "This place gives me the creeps," Lyra whispered, her flashlight beam trembling slightly as she scanned the walls. "Stay focused," Kale ordered, though he couldn't deny the unease prickling at the back of his neck. They moved cautiously through the corridors, their footsteps echoing eerily. In one chamber, they found evidence of what had happened here, bodies, or what remained of them. Twisted skeletons lay scattered across the floor, their bones fused together in grotesque shapes. Some still clutched weapons, frozen mid-fight against an unseen enemy. "What did this?" Lyra murmured, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, Jax spotted something scrawled on the wall in what looked like dried blood. He shone his light on it, revealing jagged symbols that formed a chilling message. "Do not answer the call." The words sent a shiver down everyone's spine. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Kale broke the silence. "Too late for that," he said grimly. "Let's grab whatever intel we can and get out of here." As they continued their search, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, and faint whispers echoed through the halls. Whether it was their imagination or something more sinister, none of them wanted to find out. By the time they returned to the Eclipse blade, they carried data chips filled with fragmented logs and recordings. But the ominous warning lingered in their minds, a reminder that some calls were better left unanswered. Weeks passed as the Eclipse blade followed the faint trail of the signal deeper into uncharted space. The journey was long and tense, with each passing day bringing new questions and fewer answers. Kale spent most of his time in the cockpit, staring at the endless expanse of stars while trying to ignore the gnawing sense of unease that had settled in his gut. Jax prowled the ship like a caged animal, cleaning weapons or muttering dark predictions about what awaited them. Only Dr. Lyra Voss seemed unaffected, her mind consumed by the alien data they'd recovered from the derelict ship. "This is incredible," she said one evening, her voice brimming with excitement as she reviewed the logs on her datapad. "These symbols, they're part of a language, a very advanced one." "Great," Jax grumbled from across the room. "So we're chasing some fancy talkers who left us a cryptic suicide note. That's comforting." Lyra ignored him, her eyes glued to the screen. "If I can decode more of it, we might finally understand who sent the signal. And why." Kale leaned forward in his seat. Anything useful yet? Not much, she admitted. But there are references to light and something called the Vorith. Does that mean anything to you? Kale shook his head. Never heard of them. Well, whoever or whatever they are, they're important, Lyra said firmly. And if we're lucky, we'll find out soon. Her words proved prophetic. 2 days later, the eclipse blade emerged from hyperspace near a shimmering planet bathed in perpetual twilight. Its surface glowed faintly, as though lit from within, and massive crystalline structures jutted skyward like jagged teeth. It was beautiful and utterly alien. There, Lyra whispered, pointing to a cluster of lights hovering above the planet's surface. That must be where the signal's coming from. Kale guided the ship closer, his hand steady on the controls despite the knot of tension in his chest. As they approached, the source of the signal revealed itself, not a structure, but beings. Ethereal forms floated gracefully in the air, their bodies shifting like liquid sunlight. They pulsed softly, casting rainbow hues across the surrounding area. What are they? Jax asked, his usual sarcasm replaced by genuine awe. The Lumaville. Lyra breathed, her voice trembling with wonder. I've read about them in old texts. They're supposed to be made of pure energy, beings of light. The Lumaville turned toward the eclipse blade, their movements fluid and deliberate. One of them extended a tendril-like appendage, which began to glow brighter. Moments later, a voice echoed inside the ship, not through speakers, but directly in their minds. You have come. Kale exchanged a glance with his crew before replying cautiously. We heard your call. Who are you? What do you want? The Lumaville hesitated, their glow dimming slightly. When they spoke again, their tone carried an unmistakable weight of sorrow. We are the last of our kind. The Vorith, they hunt us. They consume all life, leaving only emptiness behind. Jax frowned. So you're saying these Vorith things are after you? Why should we care? Before Kale could intervene, Lyra stepped forward. Because if they destroy you, they'll come for us next. Isn't that right? The Lumaville's light flickered, almost like a nod. You are Deathworlders. Your strength is legend among the stars. Help us fight the Vorith, and we will share our knowledge, our technology, with you. Kale rubbed his temples, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Helping the Lumaville meant risking everything. For humanity, for his crew, for himself. But refusing meant turning away from a species in desperate need, and possibly dooming his own people in the process. We'll help, he said finally, his voice firm. But know this, we don't trust easily. If you're hiding something, we'll find out. The Lumaville pulsed brightly, their gratitude evident. Thank you, Deathworlders. Together, we may yet survive. As the team prepared to disembark, Jax muttered under his breath, survive, or get ourselves killed faster. Kale didn't respond. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger and far deadlier than any of them realized. The Lumaville led Kale and his crew to a sprawling crystalline structure that seemed to grow out of the planet's surface like an organic forest. The air shimmered with faint golden light, casting everything in a surreal glow. As they stepped inside, the walls pulsed gently, as though alive, responding to their presence. It was beautiful, but unsettling. Every step felt like walking into the heart of something ancient and unknowable. This place, it's incredible, Lyra whispered, her eyes wide with wonder as she scanned the environment with her handheld device. It's not just architecture, it's alive. The entire structure is part of them. Jax scowled, keeping his rifle close. Yeah, great. Let's hope it doesn't decide we're dinner. Kale ignored him, focusing instead on the task at hand. The Lumaville had promised to share their knowledge and technology in exchange for humanity's help, but trust wasn't easy to come by, especially when dealing with beings so alien. He turned to one of the Lumaville, its form shifting like liquid sunlight. You said you need our help fighting the Vorith. Tell us more about them. The Lumavel paused, their glow dimming slightly as if weighed down by sorrow. The Vorith are a hive mind species. They communicate through sound waves, paralyzing their prey before consuming them. They leave nothing behind, not even ashes. Lyra frowned, typing furiously on her datapad. Sound-based attacks. That explains the static interference in the signal. If we can disrupt their communication, maybe we can weaken them. Kale nodded thoughtfully. Sounds like a plan. But how do we fight something that's already wiped out civilizations? We have weapons, the Lumavel replied, leading them deeper into the structure. They entered a vast chamber filled with glowing artifacts, strange devices that hummed with energy. These are tools of defense, crafted over millennia. Use them wisely. As the team examined the equipment, tensions began to rise. Jax picked up one of the devices, turning it over in his hands. This looks fancy, but I don't see how it helps us against bugs big enough to swallow a ship whole. It's not just about brute force. Lyra countered, her voice sharp. If we understand their biology, or their tech, we might find a way to exploit their weaknesses. But not everyone shared her optimism. Some members of the crew exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves. One of them, a young engineer named Tessa, approached Cal hesitantly. Captain, are we sure about this? These Lumavel, they seem friendly now, but what if they're using us? What if we're just pawns in whatever game they're playing? Cal sighed, knowing she had a point. Trust was fragile, especially here. We stay cautious. Keep your eyes open and your weapons ready. Things took a darker turn later that day when Jack stumbled upon a hidden chamber while exploring the structure. Inside, he found rows of containment pods, each holding grotesque, writhing creatures, part insect, part machine. Their bodies twitched violently, emitting low, guttural sounds. What the hell is this? Jack shouted, calling the others over. Lyra gasped, her face pale. They're experimenting on the Vorith, trying to weaponize them. The revelation sparked outrage among the crew. Accusations flew, with some demanding they abandon the Lumavel immediately. Kale stepped between them, raising his voice to be heard. Enough. We stick to the mission. For now. But if anyone feels betrayed, speak up after we deal with the Vorith. The Lumavel, sensing the tension, approached cautiously. We sought only to protect ourselves, to survive. Survival doesn't excuse betrayal, Kale said coldly. Remember this. If you cross us, there won't be a second chance. The Lumavel's light flickered, almost apologetically. For now, the alliance held, but barely. As the team prepared for the coming battle, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on shaky ground. The Vorith weren't the only threat lurking in the shadows. The calm before the storm didn't last long. Within hours of their tense confrontation with the Lumavel, alarms blared across the crystalline structure. The air vibrated with a deep, resonant hum that made Cal's teeth ache. Outside, the sky darkened as massive shapes descended from orbit, ships unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Jagged and insectoid, they moved with predatory grace, blotting out the shimmering twilight. They're here, Lyra whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at the monitors displaying the incoming fleet. The Vorith. Kale clenched his fists, his jaw tight. There was no time for second-guessing now. Get to your positions. We need to hold them off until we can figure out how to disrupt their hive mind. The battle began with a deafening roar. The Vorith unleashed swarms of biomechanical drones, each one bristling with weapons and claws. They scuttled across the landscape like metallic spiders, their glowing eyes scanning for targets. The Lumavel activated their defenses, sending waves of energy rippling through the crystalline structures. Beams of light shot outward, vaporizing dozens of drones in an instant, but more kept coming. Inside the structure, Kale and his team worked frantically to fortify their position. Jax manned a makeshift turret mounted near one of the entrances, firing bursts of plasma into the advancing horde. His face was grim, sweat dripping down his temples as he shouted over the chaos. "These things don't stop. How many are there?" "Too many," Tessa yelled back, reloading her weapon while dodging blasts of energy from enemy fire. "We can't keep this up forever." Lyra, meanwhile, focused on implementing her plan to disrupt the Vorith's communication. She crouched beside a console, her fingers flying over the keys as she interfaced with both human and Lumivel technology. "I'm almost there. Just need a few more seconds." But seconds felt like hours under the relentless assault. The Vorith adapted quickly, their drones learning to avoid direct attacks and instead target weak points in the structure. Cracks began to form in the crystalline walls, glowing faintly before shattering into shards. The Lumivel fought valiantly, their forms pulsing with intense light as they unleashed devastating bursts of energy. But even they couldn't stem the tide. Kale spotted a group of drones breaking through a side corridor and sprinted toward them, rifle raised. He fired methodically, taking down 2 before ducking behind cover as return fire scorched the ground around him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw one of the Lumivel collapse, its radiant form flickering and dimming as it succumbed to the onslaught. "We're losing ground," Kale barked into his comm. "Lyra, status." "I've got it," she shouted triumphantly. With a final keystroke, the console emitted a high-pitched whine, followed by a burst of static that rippled outward in all directions. For a moment, everything went silent. Then the Vorith froze. Their drones stopped mid-motion, twitching erratically as if confused. Even the larger ships hovering above seemed to hesitate, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Lyra grinned despite the exhaustion etched on her face. It worked. Their hive mind is scrambled. "Don't celebrate yet," Kale warned, stepping cautiously toward a fallen drone. Its glowing eyes flickered weakly, but it didn't attack. "This won't last forever." He was right. Within minutes, the Vorith began recovering, their movements regaining purpose. But the disruption had bought them precious time and hope. "We can do this," Kale said, rallying his team. "Stick together, stay sharp. If we hit them hard enough, maybe we can break them for good." As the battle raged on, humanity's ingenuity shone brightly against the overwhelming odds. Yet Kale couldn't shake the feeling that the Vorith were learning, adapting not just to their tactics, but to them. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't mindless beasts, and that realization filled him with dread. The battlefield was a cacophony of chaos, blasts of energy, the screech of metal against crystal, and the relentless hum of Vorith drones filling the air. Kale's team fought with everything they had, their makeshift weapons holding their own against the alien invaders. But even as humanity's ingenuity turned the tide momentarily, cracks began to form, not just in the crystalline walls, but in the fragile alliance between humans and Lumivel. It started with whispers among the crew. Tessa approached Kale during a brief lull in the fighting, her face pale and her voice low. "Captain, you need to see this." She led him to a hidden chamber deep within the Lumivel structure, one that hadn't been part of the tour. Inside, rows of containment pods lined the walls, each holding grotesque, writhing creatures, part insect, part machine. Their bodies twitched violently, emitting guttural sounds that sent shivers down Cal's spine. "What is this?" Kale demanded, turning to Lyra, who stood nearby, her data pad glowing faintly as she scanned the room. "It's horrifying," Lyra admitted, her voice shaky. "They're experimenting on the Vorith, trying to weaponize them." Jack stepped forward, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression dark. "So much for peaceful beings of light. Looks like they're no better than the bugs out there." Kale clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't part of the deal. They lied to us. Before he could say more, one of the Lumivel entered the chamber, its glow dimming slightly as it sensed the tension in the room. "We did what we had to do," it said, its voice echoing in their minds. "The Vorith are relentless. We sought only to protect ourselves. to survive. Survival doesn't excuse betrayal, Kale snapped, stepping closer. You used us from the start, didn't you? You knew we'd come running if you cried for help. The Lumavel hesitated, their light flickering uncertainly. We needed allies. Without you, we would have perished long ago. And now we might perish because of you, Jax growled, raising his rifle. Let's torch this place and be done with it. No, Kale said firmly, lowering Jax's weapon. We still need them. For now. But mark my words. If this comes back to bite us, I won't hesitate to pull the trigger myself. The uneasy truce held, for the moment. But trust was shattered. Back on the front lines, the battle raged on. The Vorath adapted faster than anyone expected, their drones beginning to bypass the scrambled hive mind. Worse still, the experiments in the hidden chamber backfired. One of the containment pods ruptured, releasing a mutated Vorath creature, a hulking monstrosity with jagged limbs and glowing red eyes. It tore through the structure, indiscriminately attacking both humans and Lumavel alike. Panic spread as the team scrambled to contain the threat. Kale led a desperate charge, using EMP grenades to disable the creature temporarily. But every step felt heavier, every decision clouded by doubt. Were they truly fighting to save the Lumavel, or were they pawns in a war they never should have joined? As the mutated Vorath collapsed in a heap of sparking machinery and twitching flesh, Kale caught sight of something chilling. Symbols etched into the walls of the chamber, written in the same blood-red script as the warning aboard the derelict ship. Do not answer the call. The words burned in his mind as he realized the truth. The Lumavel weren't victims. They were survivors willing to sacrifice anything, even humanity, to ensure their own survival. And now, Kale and his crew were caught in the crossfire. We can't trust them, Kale muttered under his breath, watching as the Lumavel worked feverishly to repair their defenses. Not anymore. But with the Vorath closing in, betrayal was a luxury they couldn't afford. At least, not yet. The mutated Vorath creature's rampage left a trail of destruction in its wake, forcing Kale and his team to retreat deeper into the crystalline structure. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burnt metal, while the walls pulsed erratically, as if the Lumavel themselves were struggling to maintain their composure. Amidst the chaos, Kale knew they couldn't keep fighting defensively forever. They needed a plan, one that would end this war before it consumed them all. We can't stay here, Kale said, his voice cutting through the noise as he gathered his crew in a makeshift command center. If we don't take the fight to them, they'll overwhelm us. Lyra nodded, her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes sharp. We've disrupted their hive mind once. If we can hit the source, their mothership, we might be able to collapse their entire network. Jax frowned, reloading his rifle. Sounds like a suicide mission. How do you even get close to something that big without getting turned into space dust? Kale glanced at the Lumavel hovering nearby, their forms flickering faintly. They'll help us breach it, or so they claim. Either way, it's our best shot. The Lumavel stepped forward, their light steadying slightly. The mothership is the heart of the Vorath. Destroy it, and their forces will falter. But entering it will require great sacrifice. Sacrifice, Jax scoffed. Funny how that word keeps coming up when it's not your neck on the line. Kale ignored him, focusing instead on the task ahead. What do we need to do? We will guide you to the core, the Lumavel replied. But beware, the Vorath are not mindless beasts. They learn quickly, and they adapt faster than any foe you have faced. With little time to waste, Kale assembled a small strike team. Himself, Lyra, Jax, and Tessa, armed with scavenged weapons and experimental tech provided by the Lumavel, they boarded a sleek alien shuttle designed for stealth. As they launched toward the looming mothership, a jagged monstrosity bristling with spires and glowing veins, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The infiltration began with eerie silence. The mothership's interior was a labyrinth of organic corridors, pulsating walls, and strange biomechanical machinery. Every step felt wrong, as though the ship itself was alive and watching them. Lyra scanned the environment with her data pad, trying to locate the central core. "This way," she whispered, pointing down a narrow passage. They moved cautiously, avoiding patrols of Vorath drones that skittered along the walls like insects. At one point, Jax froze, holding up a fist to signal danger. Ahead, a group of larger Vorath warriors stood guard, their armored bodies gleaming menacingly under dim red lights. "Too many to fight head-on," Kale murmured. "We go around." But as they backtracked, the walls began to shift. Literally, organic tendrils sprouted from the floor and ceiling, blocking their path. A low hum filled the air, growing louder until it became almost unbearable. Then the Vorath appeared, surrounding them. "There's no way out," Tessa said, her voice trembling as she raised her weapon. Kale clenched his jaw, scanning for an opening. "Stay close." We pushed through. Just as the Vorath lunged, Lyra activated a device given to her by the Lumavel, a sonic disruptor. A high-pitched shriek erupted, causing the creatures to recoil in agony. Seizing the opportunity, the team sprinted past, diving into a side corridor. Finally, they reached the core chamber, a massive, pulsating orb suspended in midair, surrounded by writhing cables and glowing conduits. Lyra worked quickly, planting explosives while Kale and Jax covered her. As the charges armed, Kale noticed something unsettling. Carvings on the walls depicting the Vorath, not as monsters, but as sentient beings. Before he could process what it meant, alarms blared, and the room shook violently. "They know we're here," Jax shouted, firing at incoming drones. "We're out of time," Kale yelled. "Fall back." With seconds to spare, they detonated the core. The explosion rippled through the ship, collapsing the hive mind. But as they fled, Kale couldn't shake the image of those carvings. Had they just destroyed a species, or saved themselves from extinction? The cost of victory weighed heavily on them all. The escape from the Vorath mothership was a blur of chaos and adrenaline. The team sprinted through collapsing corridors as the ship's organic structure began to disintegrate around them, walls crumbling and floors buckling under the strain of the core's destruction. Lyra led the way, clutching her data pad like a lifeline, while Kale brought up the rear, firing bursts at pursuing drones that scuttled after them with relentless determination. "This thing's falling apart faster than I thought," Jax shouted over the deafening roar of collapsing machinery. He grabbed Tessa by the arm as she stumbled, pulling her upright just as a chunk of the ceiling crashed down where she'd been standing moments before. "Keep moving," Kale barked, his voice hoarse but firm. "We're almost there." Ahead, the shuttle bay loomed into view, its entrance partially blocked by twisted metal and sparking conduits. The Lumavel had promised to hold this position open for them, but doubt gnawed at Kale. Had they abandoned the humans to die? Or worse, had they intended this outcome all along? As they reached the bay, their fears were momentarily assuaged. A group of Lumavel hovered near the shuttle, their forms flickering erratically as if drained of energy. One of them turned toward the team, its light dim but steady. "Hurry. The collapse is accelerating." No one needed to be told twice. They piled into the shuttle, strapping themselves in as Kale took the controls. With a surge of power, the craft launched out of the dying mothership, narrowly avoiding chunks of debris that tumbled past like cosmic shrapnel. Behind them, the massive vessel imploded in a brilliant flash of light, sending shockwaves rippling through space. For a moment, silence filled the cabin. Everyone sat stunned, catching their breath as the enormity of what they'd done sank in. They had destroyed the Vorath hive mind, but at what cost? Kale stared out the viewport, watching the remnants of the mothership drift away into nothingness. His hands tightened on the controls as he replayed the carvings he'd seen in the core chamber. Sentient beings, not monsters. Could the Vorath have once been something more? And had humanity just committed genocide? Lyra broke the silence, her voice soft but insistent. "Kale, we didn't have a choice. If we hadn't stopped them, they would have kept coming. For us, for the Lumavel, for everyone." "I know," Kale replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But that doesn't make it right." Jax leaned back in his seat, his usual sarcasm replaced by grim reflection. "War never is. Doesn't matter if it's bugs or people. You do what you gotta do to survive." Tessa nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes. "Doesn't mean we can forget about it, though. Those carvings, they looked so human, like they were trying to tell us something." Kale exhaled sharply, turning the shuttle toward the planet below. The Lumavel awaited them, their glowing forms visible even from orbit. As much as he wanted answers and justice, he knew they weren't finished yet. Humanity still owed these fragile allies a debt, however tainted it might now feel. When they landed, the Lumavel greeted them with subdued gratitude. Their light pulsed faintly, as if mourning alongside the humans. "You have saved us," one of them said, though its tone carried an undertone of sorrow. "But the price has been great." Kale stepped forward, his expression hard. "Don't thank us yet. You used us, lied to us, and put us in harm's way without telling us the truth. If we're going to move forward, things change. No more secrets." The Lumavel hesitated, their glow flickering uncertainly. Finally, they nodded. "We will honor your terms. But remember, the galaxy is vast, and danger always lingers beyond the horizon." As the team prepared to leave, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that their victory was hollow. They had survived, yes, but survival came with scars. And somewhere out there, among the stars, other threats waited, patient and unknowable. For now, though, they lived to fight another day. The journey back to the colony was quiet, each member of the crew lost in their own thoughts. The Eclipse blade hummed steadily through the void, its battered hull bearing the scars of battles fought and survived. Kale sat in the cockpit, staring out at the endless expanse of stars. His mind replayed the events on the Vorith mothership, the destruction, the carvings, the weight of decisions made in desperation. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line, one that might haunt humanity for generations to come. When they finally arrived, the colony greeted them as heroes. News of their victory spread quickly, carried by excited whispers and glowing reports from those who had stayed behind. The miners and engineers lined up to cheer, waving tools and makeshift banners as the ship touched down. For a brief moment, Kale allowed himself to feel pride, not just in what they had accomplished, but in how far humanity had come since stepping into the stars. But the celebration didn't last long. In the days that followed, Kale called a meeting with the colony's leaders. Around a worn table in the command center, he laid out everything they had discovered about the Vorith, their origins, their hive mind, and the unsettling truth hidden in the carvings. They weren't always monsters, Kale said, his voice heavy with regret. We may have wiped out an entire species without even knowing why. The room fell silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. One of the leaders, a grizzled engineer named Mara, spoke up. You did what you had to do. Survival isn't pretty, Kale, but it's necessary. Kale nodded, though her words offered little comfort. Maybe. But if we're going to keep surviving, we need to be better than this. Smarter, stronger, and maybe kinder. Word of the Vorith spread beyond the colony, reaching other human settlements scattered across the galaxy. Debates erupted over humanity's role in galactic affairs. Were they protectors, conquerors, or something else entirely? Some hailed the Deathworlders as saviors, while others questioned whether their actions had set a dangerous precedent. Kale listened to the arguments with a weary detachment, knowing there were no easy answers. One evening, as he stood alone in the control room, another signal came through. Faint and distorted, it carried a single phrase repeated over and over. Help us. Kale froze, his heart pounding. It wasn't the same voice as before. It was deeper, more guttural, almost mechanical. Whoever, or whatever, it was, It sounded desperate and familiar. He stared at the console, torn between caution and curiosity. The last call had led them into a nightmare. Could they afford to answer another? Behind him, Lyra entered the room, noticing the tension in his posture. "What is it?" Kale hesitated, then played the message for her. Her eyes widened as she listened, her fingers instinctively reaching for her datapad. "It's not Vorith," she said after a moment. "But it's close. Too close." Jax appeared in the doorway, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "Let me guess. Another suicide mission." Kale turned to face them, his expression resolute. "If we ignore it, we'll never know what's out there. And if history's taught us anything, ignorance doesn't keep us safe." Lyra nodded slowly, determination replacing her initial shock. "Then we go. Together." Jax sighed, shaking his head. "Figures. Just once. I'd like to catch a break." As the team prepared to leave once again, Kale glanced out at the stars. The universe was vast and full of dangers, yes, but also mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Humanity had earned its reputation as Deathworlders, not because they sought war, but because they refused to back down when faced with the unknown. With renewed purpose, Kale set course for the source of the new signal. Whatever awaited them, they would face it head-on, as survivors, as explorers, and as Deathworlders.